Thanks very much, Dennis. Thank you. I feel a bit of pressure speaking for the entire UK here. And I imagine that my main contribution is going to be to say things that annoy all four of the other constituent contributors equally. So hopefully I will live up to that billing. But thanks very much for asking me to participate. And thanks very much in particular to Professor Douglas Scott for the brilliant lecture on so brilliantly tracking and framing the current dire state of the union and the challenges that it faces today. I think one of the things I particularly liked about that lecture, and I want to sort of use to frame my own reflections briefly, was the terminology used by Professor Douglas Scott to sort of describe the differences between federalism, the devolved state, unitary states, union states, and so on. And I particularly found helpful the idea that what the UK ought to be aiming for, perhaps to move beyond devolution, or to perhaps to enhance our system of devolution, is to think about the idea of self-rule plus shared rule. And I think that's a really interesting way of framing the challenge for thinking about the future direction of reform to the UK. I think the thing that perhaps Professor Douglas Scott identified as the most, or one of the key obstacles at the UK level, is something that I'm going to focus on in my comments, is the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, which she described as a crucial obstacle to further reform, whether that be the introduction of federalism or something different, something which deepened the sort of the powers, and the opportunities available to what are currently the devolved nations within the UK. I think I agree with her that federalism, in many ways, in a practical sense, seems a remote prospect at the moment for a number of reasons that she gave. I think partly for the reasons that she explained in her lecture. Actually, there's so much in flux in the union at the moment that it would be a very difficult time, I think, to try and introduce such a kind of potentially rigid reform to the UK. A lot of that flows from Brexit and the ongoing aftermath of Brexit, but I don't think it only flows from Brexit as well. Brexit has revealed deeper constitutional problems or enduring constitutional problems between the UK and many of its constituent nations. But I also think, probably as she discussed there, that there are the political incentives behind a move to federalism at the UK level are not entirely obvious. Perhaps with the exception of Wales, but it's not entirely clear that those involved in independence movements would want to commit to a federal model of the UK constitution, I think. And I think there are also good reasons to believe that it would be a difficult sell to England in its current form, at least, anyway. And if we were to move beyond England in its current form, then, as I imagine that Alison will talk about, then that raises its own set of distinct challenges. But I think my main reflection is that perhaps I wouldn't give up on reform just because, or if federalism seems like it is not an immediate or realistic prospect for the UK at the moment. But I also think I'm sceptical of the idea that there is a distinct binary between federalism on the one hand and a system of parliamentary sovereignty on the other hand. And in that sense, I think we can probably be trying to explore the space and possibilities and opportunities between those two different extremes. In other words, to go back to that terminology that Professor Douglas Scott used, I would be interested in thinking for the UK about how we could move to a system based on self-rule plus shared rule, but perhaps without a formal division of sovereignty of the kind that a federal constitutional system would embed. And I think that's particularly an interesting challenge for us in thinking about reform to the union, bearing in mind changes in our understanding of parliamentary sovereignty which have occurred over recent decades as well. I'm not so convinced that parliamentary sovereignty should be understood as an absolute immovable thing which prevents any kind of better sharing of power between the different legislatures within the UK. I don't think we necessarily have to abandon the idea of parliamentary sovereignty either to move towards a greater sharing of power within the UK. And the reason I think that is that there are understandings of parliamentary sovereignty which do see Parliament, the UK Parliament, as having the power to place constraints or conditions on its own lawmaking authority. And this would be what is often in academic terms called the manner and form theory of parliamentary sovereignty. And I think it's one that has become increasingly reflected in the UK's constitutional practice recently. So to break down this idea further, that we might want to think about what the space is between federalism and some sort of absolutist conception of parliamentary sovereignty, I just want to sort of reflect briefly on two things. First of all, I think if we're going to really take up that challenge, then we need to think about institutions and we need to think about processes. Institutions, I think, is in some ways the more straightforward issue, although straightforward in a theoretical sense, not straightforward in the sense of being easy to deliver. Obviously, there's an ongoing review at the UK level involving the UK government and the devolved administrations as well of intergovernmental relations, but the suggestions are that that's dragging on. I imagine the results of it are potentially going to be relatively timid. And if we really want to think seriously about this space between parliamentary sovereignty and federalism, then a better institutional system for regulating and facilitating intergovernmental interaction is absolutely essential as a starting point there. Whether that's looking at proposals like a more formalised Council of Ministers, something that the Welsh Government has been talking about for a serious amount of time, I think that would be part of the picture for me. Underpinned by statute, not underpinned by internal governmental practices, something with real constitutional clout. I also think, probably as the Dunlop Review suggested, we need to be looking at reform to the UK's own organisation of its governmental ministries as well. You know, the need for a serious UK ministry dealing with constitutional issues and devolved affairs in a sort of a coherent way and a comprehensive way, I think is clearly apparent. In a sense, though, both of those two things could be done, and perhaps other institutional reforms as well, that could be delivered without any real radical change to the structures of the UK's constitutional principles. The more challenging bit, I think, is if we were to try and think about processes and reforming legislative processes in a way which go beyond what we have at the moment, with devolved consent underpinned by constitutional conventions and practice, and even then not always adhered to, as Brexit so clearly demonstrates. But I think a manner and form understanding of sovereignty, an understanding of parliamentary sovereignty which says in some circumstances parliaments may not be able to bind their successors absolutely, but they can certainly create legislative processes which introduce new conditions which are a legally binding part of the lawmaking process. I think this is the direction in which we ought to be looking, whether that is building on the kinds of permanence clauses that we already see in the devolved in the devolved statutes in Scotland and Wales, whether that's looking again at the kind of use of referendums in the Northern Irish devolution legislation. You know, there is a referendum legally guaranteed there underpinning the status of Northern Ireland within the UK. There's no reason that can't also be extended to other devolved institutions, in principle, at least. And just because in the first Miller case, the UK Supreme Court was unconvinced by the statutory basis given to the Sewell Convention, doesn't mean that there aren't better ways of trying to embed consent requirements and co-decision making requirements in relation to certain legislative matters into law. I don't think that was necessarily the intention of Parliament, or certainly they didn't make that intention, if it was their intention, clear simply by saying we recognise the existence of a convention. So I can understand why the Supreme Court reached the decision they did in Miller 1. So if you want to do that properly, then you need to legislate properly to make it happen. So now these are just some very open possibilities, and obviously it would need the way this was done would need to be thought about much more carefully. It would need to involve all the relevant stakeholders, UK and devolved. But I think what I'm just to finish, what I'm trying to suggest is that I wouldn't necessarily see parliamentary sovereignty. It may be an obstacle to federalism, but I don't think it's an obstacle to a better functioning union, and a union which extends the powers of the devolved nations and produces better government in the UK, which involves a wider range of institutional voices in a serious way. You know, parliamentary sovereignty didn't prevent EU membership. It didn't prevent devolution. It hasn't prevented human rights legislation. It has been a sufficiently malleable concept to accommodate all of these major constitutional changes. But the point is, the political will has to exist to want to make those constitutional changes. So I'm not necessarily sure that parliamentary sovereignty is an absolute barrier to greater reform here. I think the question is there political will to try and rethink the possibilities that parliamentary sovereignty might offer? I'm not sure that there is, but that's certainly at the moment. But I do think if there was the political will, even without moving to a full federal model for the UK, there are still absolutely some possibilities that are open to further examination. So I'll finish there. Thanks.